Maya Ellis walked through the polished expanse of the airport terminal, her carry-on rolling quietly behind her. The sound of her heels, rhythmic and steady, was one of the few constants in a life that rarely slowed. Today, though, was different. Today, she was not a lawyer preparing for court or a professional navigating the demanding nuances of corporate America. Today, she was just Maya, a woman on her way to a long-overdue vacation. The check-in counter for her flight came into view. A bright sign declaring the airline's name in sleek letters. She adjusted the strap of her leather tote. The weight of years of effort, success, and compromises settling more heavily on her shoulders than the bag ever could. "Good morning," she greeted the attendant, her tone polite but firm, offering her ID and a rare, indulgent request. "I'd like to upgrade to first class. Please." The attendant glanced up, her smile practiced and pleasant. Her hands moved efficiently over the keyboard. "Let me see what we have available for you. Ms. Ellis." Ms. Ellis. The title still felt strange. Even after years of earning it. As a child, she had listened to people call her mother, Miss. Spoken with a tone more akin to reprimand than respect. How many years had it taken to reshape that word into something that fit her? Something she could carry without flinching? "You're in luck," the attendant said, drawing Maya back to the moment. "There's one seat left." The price of the upgrade was quoted high enough to make her hesitate on another day. But today was different. She handed over her card without a second thought. For once, she wasn't thinking about the budget, the savings plan, or the self-denial that had paved her road to success. Today was about the small luxury of saying yes. After passing through security, Maya bought herself an overpriced coffee. It was bitter and burnt, but the heart drawn into the foam felt like a small kindness. She sat by a window, watching the planes taxi and take off, each one a capsule of lives and stories heading somewhere else. She felt a fleeting connection to the other travelers. For all their differences, rushing businessmen, fidgeting children, weary parents, they all shared the singular act of leaving. The boarding call came, and she joined the line for first class. She noticed a few glances from other passengers as she approached the gate. Some quick and indifferent, others lingering just long enough to feel like an assessment. Maya wasn't new to these moments. The subtle question marks people projected. A woman like her, boarding a plane like this, sitting in a cabin like that. She'd learned to ignore the flickers of doubt in their eyes, or at least she thought she had. The first-class cabin was a world unto itself. Plush seats, soft lighting, and the quiet hum of people accustomed to this kind of comfort. As Maya found her seat by the window, she allowed herself a small exhale of relief. The leather was cool against her palms as she ran her fingers over the armrests. A flight attendant appeared, offering a warm towel and a choice of champagne or water. She chose the water. The effervescence of celebration could wait. As she settled in, her gaze wandered to the other passengers. The businessman across the aisle had already opened his laptop, his screen glowing with spreadsheets. An older couple shared a quiet conversation, their hands brushing together now and then in a way that suggested decades of companionship. Maya liked to imagine their story maybe an anniversary trip, a return to a place they'd loved when they were young. Her observations were interrupted by a low voice from behind her. "Excuse me." She turned to see a man, middle-aged, well-dressed in a tailored suit, with the kind of confidence that came from occupying spaces like this for a lifetime. He gestured vaguely toward her overhead bin. "While you're up there," he said, "could you grab my bag too?" The words were casual, as if you were asking a waiter for a refill. Maya froze for half a second, her hand still on her own bag. "Pardon me," she said, her voice quiet, her tone neutral. He barely looked at her, his attention already back on his phone. "The gray one. And I'll take a scotch when you get a chance." The air between them stilled. Maya's chest tightened, not with anger, not yet, but with that familiar mix of disbelief and weariness. This wasn't the first time she'd been mistaken for someone she wasn't. It wasn't even the first time this month. She glanced at her tailored blazer, her carry-on that was small enough to meet the most rigid airline specifications. Her assigned seat. "I'm not a flight attendant," she said, her tone level. "I'm a passenger." The man blinked, his face flickering between confusion and mild embarrassment. Then came the inevitable recovery. The subtle shift in his expression that said, "Ah, I see." But what Maya saw was different. She saw the long shadow of assumptions she had spent a lifetime navigating. "Oh," he said finally. "I just thought, well, never mind." The apology didn't come, and Maya didn't press for one. She turned back to her seat, adjusting her bag with deliberate care. Around her, the cabin carried on, the other passengers pretending not to notice what had passed between them. But she felt their attention anyway, heavy in its silence. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Maya leaned back in her seat, looking out at the tarmac. The man behind her had already moved on, his voice rising in easy conversation with someone else. For him, this moment would fade into the blur of his day, a footnote he might not even remember by the time they landed. But for Maya, it lingered, not as an outrage, but as another entry in a quiet ledger she didn't ask to keep. A record of moments, small and sharp, that told her the world still saw her through a narrow lens. The engines roared, and the plane lifted into the sky. The city below grew smaller, its lights blinking against the darkness. Maya closed her eyes, trying to let the weight of it all slip away. She had a vacation to enjoy, a week to be something other than what the world projected onto her. But even at 35,000 feet, some things were harder to leave behind than others. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady and unchanging, a backdrop to the quiet movements of the flight attendants and the murmured conversations of the passengers. Maya Ellis sat motionless in her seat, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest. She stared out the window at the endless expanse of sky, a pale blue horizon giving way to the thin, ethereal clouds. The view was beautiful but offered little solace. Behind her, the man who had mistaken her for a flight attendant was talking again, his voice rising and falling with the easy cadence of someone accustomed to being heard. Maya didn't catch his words, she wasn't trying to. But the sound of him confident, self-assured seemed to fill the space. Uninvited and unavoidable, it was as if the earlier exchange had never happened, as if her correction hadn't lingered in his mind for more than a moment. For Maya, the moment lingered, not in the form of anger. She had long since learned that anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. No, what she felt now was something quieter, harder to define, a kind of weariness, the slow and steady erosion that came from moments like these. Countless and cumulative. The flight attendant passed by, her professional smile as polished as the silver tray she carried. Maya caught her eye briefly, a flicker of unspoken understanding passing between them. Rachel Hayes, that was her name. According to the neat plastic badge pinned to her uniform, Rachel had stepped in earlier, her calm but firm voice diffusing the situation with practiced efficiency. "Miss Ellis is exactly where she's supposed to be," Rachel had said, her words cutting through the man's casual dismissal like a blade through fog. The simplicity of her statement had felt like a small triumph, though not one Maya could fully celebrate. Triumph implied finality, a conclusion. This wasn't that. Maya's gaze returned to the window. The horizon remained unchanged, serene and distant. She thought about the countless times she had encountered these moments before. The assumptions made without malice but with a certainty that stung all the same. It was the way the man had looked at her, not unkind, not hostile, but dismissive, a glance that had measured her and found her out of place. What stayed with her was the subtlety of it all. There had been no raised voices, no overt insult to dissect later over drinks with friends. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, easy to miss, easier to dismiss. But Maya couldn't dismiss it. She never could, because for her, these moments were never isolated. They were part of a pattern, threads in a fabric she had been wrapped in her entire life. The seatbelt sign chimed off, and the cabin stirred to life. Passengers unbuckled themselves, shifting in their seats or reaching for the overhead bins. The older couple across the aisle shared a thermos of tea, their hands brushing as they passed the cup back and forth. A young man a few rows ahead pulled out a laptop, the screen lighting his face as he scrolled through emails. Life continued, unbothered, unchanged. The man behind her ordered his Scotch double, neat, and began a conversation with his seatmate, his voice low but insistent. Maya let her eyes drift closed, her head resting lightly against the leather headrest. She tried to focus on her breathing, the steady rhythm of air in and out. But the man's voice kept intruding, unrelenting in its presence. "I've been in private equity for 20 years. He was saying, the words carrying the weight of a resume. "It's a demanding field, but you learn to spot talent quickly. Efficiency is everything." Maya wondered if he had noticed her silence, her absence from the cabin's small social ecosystem. She doubted it. Men like him rarely noticed the absence of people they didn't think belonged there in the first place. The flight attendant, Rachel, stopped by Maya's seat. "Is there anything else I can get you, Miss Ellis?" she asked, her tone softer than before, almost conspiratorial. "Just water, thank you," Maya replied, offering a faint smile. She appreciated the gesture but wished it weren't necessary. The subtle emphasis on Miss Ellis was a kind of reassurance. A reminder that Maya belonged here. But why should that need reminding? As Rachel moved away, Maya picked up her Kindle and opened the novel she had been saving for this trip. It was a light-hearted beach read, the kind of story she rarely had time for during her packed workdays. But the words blurred on the screen, her mind too restless to settle into the story. Her thoughts drifted instead to the past, to the moments that had shaped her. The first time a professor had asked if she was in the wrong classroom. The way his tone had suggested it was a joke, but his eyes said otherwise. The client who had hesitated to shake her hand at their first meeting. His surprise barely masked when she introduced herself as lead counsel. The senior partner who had once mistaken her for an assistant, handing her his empty coffee cup with a distracted, "Thanks." These moments weren't traumatic in the way people often imagined racism to be. They were smaller, quieter, but no less impactful. They were the steady drip of water that wore down stone, the faint shadow that lingered even in bright light. And the hardest part wasn't enduring them, it was knowing that they might never stop. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence. A brief shudder that rippled through the cabin. Maya gripped the armrests instinctively, her fingers tightening before she let herself relax again. The man behind her fell silent for a moment, his voice replaced by the clinking of ice in his glass. Maya returned her gaze to the window. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, vast and indifferent. It offered no answers, only the quiet reminder that the world was larger than this cabin. Larger than this moment. But even as she tried to let the thought comfort her, she knew it wasn't that simple. The world might be vast, but it was also close enough to touch, to hurt, to judge. When the turbulence passed, Maya reached for her water and took a slow sip. The coldness of it grounded her, bringing her back to herself. She placed the glass back on the tray and leaned back into her seat. For now, she decided, she would let the silence hold her. There would be time later to process, to reflect, to decide what if anything she would do. But here, in the quiet hum of the cabin, with the steady thrum of the engines beneath her, she chose to simply be. Sometimes, she thought, that was the most radical act of all. The flight had settled into a calm routine. The hum of the engines a low, steady background to the measured steps of the flight attendants and the occasional rustle of newspapers or the clinking of glasses. Maya Ellis sat quietly in her seat, staring at the closed book in her lap. She hadn't turned a page in over 20 minutes. The story, some breezy romance she had hoped would be an escape, felt distant and irrelevant now, overshadowed by the tension that still hung in the air. Behind her, the man Thomas. She had overheard his name, was deep in conversation with his seatmate. His voice rose and fell in that self-assured way that suggested he was used to being listened to. His words peppered with phrases like efficiency and scalable outcomes. Maya found herself wondering if he even remembered their earlier exchange. The moment when he had looked at her and seen only what he assumed she must be. Not who she was. Probably not. For him, it was likely a blip. A trivial misunderstanding. For her, it was different. It always was. Maya shifted in her seat, trying to focus on the here and now. But her thoughts kept circling back. Moments like this didn't come in isolation, they carried the weight of history. Hers and others. Each instance was part of a larger, unspoken narrative, one she had no choice but to participate in. She glanced around the cabin, taking in her fellow passengers. The older couple across the aisle was engrossed in a travel guide. their heads tilted together in quiet concentration. The businessman in the row ahead was typing furiously on his laptop. His brow furrowed. A young woman a few rows back adjusted her headphones, her gaze distant as she stared at the seatback screen in front of her. Maya wondered how many of them had noticed what had happened earlier. How many had seen and chosen to look away. It wasn't an accusation, just a quiet observation. People avoided discomfort when they could. And she didn't blame them. But she also couldn't help but think about the cost of that avoidance. How it allowed moments like this to slip by unchallenged. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence. A brief jolt that made the glasses on her tray rattle. Around her, passengers shifted and adjusted, murmuring softly to one another. Maya steadied herself, her hands gripping the armrests for just a second before she let go. The moment passed quickly, but it left her with a strange, unsettled feeling, as though the turbulence had knocked something loose inside her. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me." Maya turned to see a young woman standing in the aisle. She was petite, with straight black hair that fell neatly over her shoulders. And she looked nervous, her hands clasped in front of her. "I hope I'm not bothering you," the woman said, her voice low. "I just wanted to say I saw what happened earlier. I mean, with that man." She glanced behind Maya, where Thomas's voice could still be heard. His conversation undisturbed. "I thought you handled it really well." Maya blinked, surprised. For a moment, she wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't used to these moments. The quiet acknowledgments from strangers who had seen and understood. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice steady. "I appreciate that." The woman nodded, her gaze earnest. "I'm Chloe, by the way. Chloe Park." She hesitated, then added, "I work in tech, and, well, things like that happen a lot in my world, too. People assuming I'm someone I'm not. Or questioning whether I belong in the room at all." Maya gave her a small, knowing smile. "I can imagine." Chloe shifted her weight, as though debating whether to say more. "It's just watching you earlier. The way you stayed calm, it was inspiring. I always get so flustered when it happens to me. I don't know how to handle it." Maya tilted her head, studying Chloe. There was something familiar in the younger woman's expression. A mix of frustration and uncertainty that Maya recognized from her own early years. She thought about all the times she had felt the same way. About the countless moments when she had wanted to speak up but hadn't known how. "It's not easy," Maya said finally, "and it's not something that comes naturally. You learn to navigate it because you have to. But that doesn't make it fair." Chloe nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I guess I just wanted to say thank you. For showing me that it's possible to stand your ground without losing your cool." Maya felt a flicker of something gratitude. Maybe, or connection. "You're welcome," she said simply. "And for what it's worth. You don't always have to stay calm. Sometimes, it's okay to let people see that they've crossed a line." Chloe smiled at that, a faint but genuine expression that softened her face. "Thanks," she said again, before stepping back toward her seat. Maya watched her go, her heart feeling just a little lighter. The turbulence had long since passed, and the cabin was calm again. But something had shifted, not dramatically, not outwardly. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the faint change in air pressure that marked their climb to cruising altitude. But it was there a reminder that even in the quiet, unseen moments, connections were being made, and change, however small, was still possible. Maya picked up her book again, the pages settling more easily beneath her fingers this time. She didn't know if Chloe's words would stay with her beyond this flight, or if they would fade into the background like so many others. But for now, they felt like a gift, a small ripple in a much larger sea. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow, signaling the transition to the quieter hours of the flight. Outside, the sky was a deep, endless blue, the faintest traces of stars beginning to emerge against the vast expanse. Inside, the rhythm of the journey continued, trays being cleared, blankets being unfolded, the hushed murmur of conversations blending with the low hum of the engines. Maya Ellis sipped her water slowly, letting the coolness ground her. The earlier turbulence, both literal and figurative, had subsided, leaving her with a strange sense of stillness. Yet, beneath that stillness, There was something else, a low hum of unresolved thoughts and emotions that she couldn't quite shake. Miss Ellis? The soft voice broke through her reverie. It was Chloe Park again, standing beside her seat with a tentative smile. Sorry to bother you, but would you mind if I joined you for a bit? There's an empty seat here. Maya glanced at the seat beside her and nodded. Of course. Chloe settled in, her movements careful, almost shy. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them companionable but expectant. It was Chloe who broke it first. I keep thinking about what you said earlier. She began, her tone quiet but earnest. About how it's okay not to stay calm all the time. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that before. Maya looked at her, studying the younger woman's face, the openness, the vulnerability. It's something I had to learn the hard way, she said after a pause. For a long time, I thought that staying calm was the only way to prove I belonged. That if I showed anger, it would just confirm what people already thought of me. Chloe nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on her hands, which rested lightly in her lap. I feel like that all the time. Like I have to be perfect. Always. Or else people will think I don't deserve to be where I am. Maya's lips curved into a small, bittersweet smile. Perfection is a heavy burden. Isn't it? Before Chloe could respond, another voice joined the conversation. It's a burden most of us have carried, in one way or another. Maya turned to see the older gentleman from across the aisle. He had kind eyes and a neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard. And his expression was one of quiet interest. James Carter, he introduced himself, extending a hand. Maya shook it, appreciating the firm but unassuming grip. Nice to meet you, Mr. Carter. James, please, he corrected gently, before turning to Chloe. I hope I'm not intruding. But I overheard a bit of your conversation. I couldn't help but relate. Chloe smiled faintly. You're not intruding. It's nice to know we're not the only ones who feel this way. James settled into the seat across the aisle, leaning forward slightly. I've been in business for 40 years, he said, his tone reflective. And let me tell you, the pressure to prove yourself doesn't go away. But it does change. You learn to carry it differently. Maya nodded, sensing the weight of experience behind his words. What do you think changes? She asked. He considered her question for a moment. I suppose it's perspective. When I was younger, I thought success meant earning respect from others. But over time, I realized it's more about respecting yourself, regardless of what anyone else thinks. Chloe frowned slightly, her gaze thoughtful. But how do you get there? I mean, when it feels like the whole world is looking for reasons to doubt you? James smiled, a little sadly. You stop waiting for the world to change first. And you find your own ways to remind yourself that you belong. As he spoke, a woman across the aisle, a silver-haired passenger who had been pretending to sleep, opened her eyes and sat up slightly. Excuse me, she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. Are you all talking about belonging? In the workplace? Maya raised an eyebrow, surprised by the question. In a way, yes. The woman smiled faintly, her gaze distant. I started as a secretary in the 70s. She said. Back then, the idea of belonging wasn't even on the table. You just survived, laughed off the comments, kept your head down, and hoped someone noticed your work someday. Chloe leaned forward, her expression a mix of interest and frustration. That's exactly what it feels like sometimes. Like you have to just endure it. The woman nodded. Endurance is important, but so is speaking up. I didn't do enough of that when I was younger. I wish I had. Maya glanced around, noticing how the conversation had drawn in others nearby. A young man in a hoodie leaned slightly into the aisle, his curiosity evident. The businessman who had been typing furiously earlier had closed his laptop, his attention now fully on the unfolding discussion. Even Rachel, the flight attendant, lingered near the back of the cabin, her expression thoughtful as she refilled water glasses. The cabin, once filled with the usual hum of in-flight activities, had taken on a different tone, a quiet, reflective energy that felt almost sacred. I think, Maya said finally, her voice measured, that these moments when we share our experiences, our struggles, they're part of the solution. They remind us that we're not alone. And they remind others that their assumptions have consequences. Even if they don't mean harm. James nodded. It's about creating ripples. One conversation. One moment at a time. That's how change happens. Chloe glanced at her phone. As though wanting to take notes. I just wish there was a way to make those ripples bigger. There is, Maya said, a faint smile touching her lips. But it takes patience. And persistence. The conversation ebbed and flowed. Each person adding their voice. Their perspective. They talked about the challenges of navigating biased workplaces. The subtle ways assumptions shaped opportunities. And the quiet resilience it took to keep pushing forward. The discussion wasn't dramatic or cathartic, it was steady, measured, and deeply human. As the hours passed, the cabin seemed to shift in some intangible way. The tension that had hung in the air earlier had softened, replaced by something gentler, more hopeful. Maya couldn't help but feel that this was the kind of moment she had always hoped for, not a grand victory, but a quiet connection, a reminder that even in the smallest of spaces, change was possible, and sometimes, that was enough. The cabin had settled into a subdued quiet, the kind that envelops long flights as passengers adjust to the unspoken rhythm of shared space. Maya Ellis sat in her seat, watching the dark expanse outside the window. The faint glow of the horizon hinted at the new day they were racing toward. Though for now, time felt suspended, measured only by the soft chime of announcements and the occasional footsteps of the flight attendants. Behind her, Thomas Grant's voice carried once again. Not loudly, but persistently. He was talking about market trends now. His tone confident, certain. It struck Maya how easily he occupied the space. His presence unself-conscious and unchallenged. She, too, had learned to take up space, but hers was a different kind of presence. Deliberate and calculated, she had spent years perfecting the art of balancing assertiveness with grace. Navigating spaces where her identity was often met with skepticism before respect. Yet moments like the one earlier, when Thomas had mistaken her for a flight attendant, still carried a weight that was hard to ignore. The turbulence inside her had not fully settled. She thought of the conversation with Chloe and James, their shared experiences illuminating both the pain and the resilience that defined so much of her journey. But the lingering tension with Thomas felt unresolved. A knot she couldn't quite untangle. She had spoken up earlier. Yes, but there was more to be said, not for him, necessarily, but for herself. Maya pressed the call button, a decision forming in her mind before she fully understood it. A moment later, Rachel appeared, her expression curious but calm. Miss Ellis, Rachel said, her voice low. Is everything all right? Yes, Maya replied, keeping her tone even. But could you ask the gentleman behind me if he has a moment to talk? I think it's time we cleared the air. Rachel's eyebrows lifted slightly in understanding. Of course. As Rachel stepped away, Maya adjusted her posture, sitting a little straighter. Her hands rested lightly on the armrests, her fingers steady despite the quickened pace of her thoughts. She wasn't entirely sure how Thomas would respond, but she knew what she needed to say. A moment later, she heard movement behind her. Turning, she saw Thomas standing in the aisle, his expression a mix of curiosity and hesitation. Mr. Grant, Maya said, her voice calm but firm. Would you mind sitting for a moment? I think we need to have a conversation. Thomas hesitated, then nodded, sinking into the empty seat beside her. Up close, he looked different, less composed. Perhaps, or simply less guarded. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to feel significant. I think we got off on the wrong foot earlier. Maya began, her tone measured. I wanted to take this opportunity to address it directly. Thomas shifted slightly, his gaze flickering between Maya and the window. I do apologize if there was a misunderstanding, he said, his voice carrying a note of discomfort. It wasn't my intention to offend. Maya nodded, acknowledging his words without letting them stand as the final say. I understand, but I think it's worth exploring why that misunderstanding happened in the first place. Thomas's brow furrowed, his discomfort deepening. I suppose I made an assumption, he admitted reluctantly. It was careless of me. It was more than careless, Maya replied, her voice steady but unyielding. It was an assumption rooted in bias, perhaps unconscious. but impactful nonetheless. Thomas opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. Maya continued, her tone remaining conversational but direct. You saw me standing there. And despite the context, my clothing, my seat, you assumed I was there to serve you. That assumption wasn't random. It came from somewhere, and it reflects a larger pattern that people like me encounter all the time. Thomas's face reddened slightly, though whether from embarrassment or reflection, Maya couldn't tell. I hadn't thought of it that way. He admitted finally. I suppose it's something I've taken for granted. Many people do, Maya said. And that's part of the problem. These moments might seem small or inconsequential, but they accumulate. They reinforce barriers that shouldn't exist in the first place. She paused, letting her words settle. Thomas sat back slightly, his expression thoughtful now, though still tinged with discomfort. You know, she said, her voice softening just slightly. I've spent my career addressing issues like this in corporate settings. I've seen how small biases, left unchecked, can create cultures where people feel invisible or undervalued. It's not about blaming individuals, it's about recognizing patterns and choosing to do better. Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to his hands. You're right, he said after a long silence. I made an assumption I shouldn't have. And I can see now how damaging that can be. Even if it wasn't intentional. Maya inclined her head, accepting his acknowledgement. The good news is that awareness is the first step. The question is, what will you do with that awareness? Thomas looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For the first time, his expression carried something close to humility. I don't know, he said honestly, but I'd like to start by learning more. If you're willing, that is. Maya studied him for a moment, gauging the sincerity in his tone. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. Handing it to him. This is my contact information, she said. My firm specializes in corporate culture training, including unconscious bias. If you're serious about making changes, we'd be happy to help. Thomas accepted the card, turning it over in his hands. Thank you, he said, his voice quieter now. I appreciate this. Maya nodded, feeling a small but significant sense of closure. The conversation wasn't perfect, it wasn't meant to be. But it was a start. A ripple in a larger sea. As Thomas returned to his seat, Maya turned back to the window. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to break, softening the horizon with shades of pink and gold. The plane moved steadily through the sky, carrying its passengers toward their destinations. For the first time in hours, Maya felt a quiet sense of peace. The work of change was slow and often exhausting, but moments like this reminded her why it was worth continuing. Small steps, she thought. Small ripples, and perhaps, one day, a wave. The soft glow of sunrise filtered through the plane's small windows, casting faint golden light across the cabin. Most of the passengers were still dozing or lost in the quiet cocoon of in-flight entertainment. The faint clatter of dishes came from the galley as the flight attendants prepared the first round of breakfast service. It was a moment of calm, the kind that felt especially fragile after a long, turbulent night. Maya Ellis sat back in her seat, her hands resting lightly in her lap. The conversation with Thomas had ended hours ago, but the echoes of it lingered, weaving themselves into her thoughts. He had taken her card, made his apology, and promised to reflect, but promises, she knew, could be as fleeting as the clouds rushing past the window. Change, real change, was rarely born from a single moment. It required persistence, action, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths long after the initial sting had faded. She turned her gaze toward Chloe, who sat a few rows ahead. The young woman was awake, her head tilted against the window, lost in her own thoughts. Maya wondered what ripples their conversation had created in her mind. Would Chloe find her voice the next time someone made an assumption about her? Would she carry the weight of their shared experiences differently now? Or perhaps more lightly? The older gentleman, James Carter, approached from the aisle, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He gestured toward the empty seat beside her, and Maya nodded her invitation for him to sit. You don't mind, do you? He asked. His tone warm but quiet, as if mindful of the stillness around them. Not at all, Maya replied. I appreciate the company. James settled into the seat. His movements unhurried. He sipped his coffee, his eyes thoughtful as he looked toward the window. I've been thinking about what you said last night. He began, his voice low, about how these small moments accumulate. You're right, of course. They do, and they leave marks on all of us. Maya nodded, letting his words settle. They do, but I think they also shape us. In ways we don't always realize. They teach us resilience, perspective, and sometimes, they even lead to connection. James smiled faintly. Connection, he echoed. That's a good way to put it. It's what we need more of. I think. People taking the time to really see each other. Beyond assumptions and first impressions. He paused, his gaze turning inward. I've spent most of my career in rooms where I was the one making decisions. I like to think I was fair. But if I'm honest, I didn't always pay attention to the ways bias could creep in. I didn't think it was my problem to solve. Maya tilted her head, studying him. There was no defensiveness in his tone. Only reflection, a rare and fragile thing. What changed? She asked. James hesitated, then let out a soft sigh. My daughter, he said simply. She's in her early 30s now. Working in finance. A smart, capable woman. But she's told me about the things she faces, the assumptions. The dismissals. The feeling of always having to prove herself. Hearing it from her, it hit me differently. Made me see things I'd overlooked for years. Maya felt a flicker of understanding. It's easier to notice when it's someone you care about. She said gently. Exactly, James said, his voice softening. But that's the thing, isn't it? We shouldn't have to wait until it's personal. We should care simply because it's right. They fell into a comfortable silence. The kind that didn't need filling. Around them, the cabin began to stir. Passengers stretching and shifting as the promise of breakfast roused them from sleep. Chloe turned slightly in her seat. Catching Maya's eye, she gave a small, tentative smile, which Maya returned. You've started something here, James said quietly, following Maya's gaze. I don't think it's just a conversation anymore. It's something more. Maya glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. It's a ripple, she said. Maybe a small one, but it's there. James chuckled softly, nodding. Ripples can travel farther than we think. Especially when the water's still. Their conversation was interrupted by Rachel, the flight attendant, who approached with a tray of coffee and orange juice. She paused, glancing between them. Good morning, Rachel said, her voice low but cheerful. Can I get you anything? Just coffee, thank you, Maya replied. As Rachel poured, she hesitated, then spoke again. I just wanted to say I've seen moments like the one last night before. But I've never seen someone handle it the way you did. It was dignified, powerful. Maya smiled faintly. Thank you, Rachel. That means a lot. Rachel nodded, her expression earnest. It meant a lot to me, too. Sometimes it's hard, seeing things play out and feeling like you can't do anything about it. But watching you, it gave me hope. Maya felt a warmth spread through her chest, not pride. Exactly, but something quieter, steadier, a recognition that the impact of her actions had reached farther than she'd realized. Thank you for saying that, she said simply. Rachel offered a small, genuine smile before moving on to the next row. James watched her go, then turned back to Maya. Hope, he said, his tone reflective. That's another ripple, isn't it? Maya nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. It is, and sometimes, it's the one that matters most. The sun had risen fully now, casting the cabin in soft, golden light. Maya looked around, seeing the faces of her fellow passengers in a new way. They were strangers, yes, but they were also part of this shared moment. This shared space. And within that space, something had shifted, not dramatically, but enough to feel like the beginning of something better. As the plane continued its journey, Maya felt a quiet resolve settle within her. The ripples they had created might be small, but they were real, and perhaps, with time, they would grow into waves. The familiar hum of office life greeted Maya Ellis as she stepped into her corner office at Carter & Ellis LLP. The polished glass walls reflected the muted tones of the city skyline outside. A world that had carried on as if nothing had changed during her week away. But for Maya, something had shifted. The flight, its conversations, its tensions had left an impression that felt too significant to ignore. She set her leather bag on the chair and placed her laptop on the desk. Her movements deliberate. Her inbox was predictably overflowing. But the usual urgency to dive in wasn't there. Instead, she opened a blank document, its cursor blinking steadily against the white screen. Waiting. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Words came slowly at first, tentative and unformed. Then, like the first light of dawn breaking over a restless sky, the ideas began to take shape, clear, direct, purposeful. This wasn't just a memo. It was a proposal, a blueprint for something larger than herself. Maya's firm had prided itself on being a modern, forward-thinking institution, but even in this polished space of legal expertise and high-level negotiations, she knew the same patterns persisted unspoken, unchecked, and far too familiar. The flight had reminded her of that. Thomas Grant's assumption had been one of many moments, but it had crystallized a truth she had long understood. Structural change was necessary, and waiting for it to arrive on its own wasn't an option. She titled the document, Beyond Inclusion, a Framework for Lasting Equity. The sound of a knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Tanya Davis, one of the firm's younger associates, peeked her head in. Her expression was a mix of curiosity and hesitation. "Do you have a minute?" Tanya asked. "Of course," Maya replied, gesturing for her to come in. Tanya stepped inside, smoothing the hem of her blazer. A nervous habit Maya recognized. "I wanted to thank you," Tanya began, her voice measured but sincere, "for that advice you gave me before the Jensen meeting. It really made a difference." Maya leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. "I'm glad to hear that. How did it go?" Tanya's face brightened, though her smile carried the weight of effort. "It went well, but it wasn't easy. The client kept addressing my male colleague. Even after I'd explained that I was leading the case, I had to keep redirecting. Over and over. It worked in the end. But," she hesitated, searching for the words, "it was exhausting." Maya nodded, her expression softening. "It always is." Tanya exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. It shouldn't be this hard. Should it? Just to be taken seriously?" "No," Maya said simply. "It shouldn't." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy with shared understanding. Then Maya turned her laptop so Tanya could see the document she had started. "I'm working on something," Maya said. "A proposal for the partners. It's about more than just inclusion. It's about creating a culture where people don't have to fight for the respect they deserve." Tanya leaned in, her eyes scanning the headings. Mentorship networks, accountability metrics, unconscious bias training. Her brows lifted slightly, and she looked at Maya with a mix of admiration and hope. "This is ambitious," Tanya said. "Do you think they'll go for it?" Maya allowed herself a faint smile. They might not have a choice. She reached for her desk drawer, pulling out a business card Thomas Grant's handed to her during their flight. She placed it on the desk between them. "Do you remember the story I told you about that flight?" Maya asked. Tanya nodded, her curiosity deepening. "That man Thomas Grant is the CEO of Apex Capital. After our conversation, he reached out to me. He wants his company to undergo comprehensive bias training, and he's interested in making us their primary legal counsel." Tanya's eyes widened. "That's huge." "It is," Maya agreed. "But he made it clear that they want to see us leading by example. They won't partner with us unless we show we're serious about creating the kind of culture we're proposing to help others build." Tanya picked up the business card, turning it over in her hands. "So this proposal, it's not just an idea. It's leverage. Leverage, and an opportunity." Maya said. "We have the chance to lead. Not just in our work, but in how we operate as a firm. But it's going to take more than just a document. It's going to take buy-in from everyone. Starting with associates like you." Tanya's expression shifted, the hesitation giving way to resolve. "What can I do?" Maya leaned forward, her tone soft but firm. "Help me refine this. Add your perspective, your experiences, and when the time comes, stand with me when I present it to the partners." Tanya nodded, her confidence growing. "I can do that." The next few hours passed in a blur of collaboration. Other associates filtered in as word spread, each bringing their own insights. They spoke of subtle slights and overlooked contributions, of mentorship gaps and the unspoken rules that seemed to govern who rose and who stayed stagnant. The air buzzed with a quiet determination, the collective energy of people ready to challenge the status quo. By the time the sun began to set, the proposal had grown into something larger and more comprehensive than Maya had imagined. It wasn't just her vision anymore, it was theirs. And that made it all the more powerful. As the associates filed out, Maya sat alone in her office, reviewing the final draft. She thought about the conversations on the flight, the ripples they had created, James's wisdom, Chloe's determination, Rachel's quiet support. Even Thomas's reluctant reflection had played a part. She saved the document and leaned back in her chair, looking out at the city below. The skyline glowed with the light of countless offices, each one filled with its own stories, its own battles. Change wouldn't come overnight, but it could start here. With this. And perhaps, she thought, with a faint but steady hope, it could start with her. The soft rumble of the plane's descent broke the stillness in the cabin. Passengers stirred, gathering their belongings, their voices hushed as they adjusted to the morning light spilling through the windows. Maya Ellis sat quietly in her first-class seat, watching the skyline of Chicago emerge through the haze. A city of opportunity and challenge, of progress and inertia, a reflection, in many ways, of the journey she had been on. This flight was different from the one that had sparked her proposal months ago. Then, she had been heading toward Bali, hoping for respite from the weight of proving herself in a world too quick to dismiss her. Now, she was en route to a conference where she would present that very weight and how she had begun to turn it into something meaningful. Her speech was the closing keynote of a corporate diversity and equity summit. She had spent hours crafting it, careful to balance the hard truths with a message of hope. But as she rehearsed the words in her mind, she realized the most powerful part of her story wasn't in the script. It was in the quiet conversations, the subtle moments of recognition, and the ripples that had begun to spread since that flight. The applause had been polite but tepid at first. Maya stood at the podium, her voice steady as she outlined the framework her firm had implemented. Clear mentorship pathways, metrics for accountability, unconscious bias training, all tools to address systemic inequities. The audience, a mix of executives and HR leaders, listened attentively, but Maya could feel the skepticism in the room. These were people used to workshops and initiatives that sounded good but rarely delivered. It wasn't until she shared the story of the flight that the room shifted. She recounted the small but revealing moment when Thomas Grant had mistaken her for a flight attendant. The quiet exchanges that followed, and the unexpected partnership that grew from their conversation. Change often starts in moments like these, Maya said, her gaze sweeping the room. Not in grand gestures or sweeping policies, but in the quiet, uncomfortable spaces where assumptions are challenged and perspectives shift. She paused, letting the words settle, and it requires more than acknowledgement. It requires action, consistent, deliberate, and uncomfortable. It's not easy, but it's necessary. The applause this time was louder, warmer. She could see it in their faces, the subtle nods, the thoughtful expressions. They weren't just hearing her, they were listening. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Maya lingered near the stage, speaking with attendees who approached her with questions or quiet words of thanks. Among them was a young black woman, her expression both nervous and determined. "Ms. Ellis," she began, "I just wanted to say, your speech meant a lot to me. I'm a junior analyst, and I've been struggling to figure out how to navigate these spaces. Hearing you talk about your journey, it gave me hope." Maya smiled, her voice gentle. "I'm glad to hear that. And remember, you don't have to navigate it alone. Find allies, build connections, and don't be afraid to speak up when it matters." The woman nodded, her shoulders straightening as she walked away. Maya watched her go, reminded of Chloe, of Tanya, of all the others who had carried their own quiet burdens. Back at the airport, waiting for her return flight, Maya reflected on how far she had come since that first conversation in the sky. The proposal she had crafted with Tanya and the others was no longer just an idea. It had transformed her firm, reshaping how they recruited, mentored, and supported their staff. Apex Capital had not only signed on as a client but had also become a public advocate for equity initiatives, using their platform to amplify the message. Even Thomas Grant had surprised her. He had attended several of the training sessions his company implemented, often sitting quietly at the back but engaging thoughtfully when invited to share. It wasn't a complete transformation, those rarely happened, but it was a start. As her plane ascended into the sky, Maya felt a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in years. The work was far from over, there were still battles to fight, assumptions to challenge, spaces to open, but she no longer felt like she was fighting alone. She glanced around the cabin, noticing the diverse mix of passengers, executives in suits, young professionals scrolling through emails, families heading home. Her gaze lingered on a young woman in a crisp blazer, sitting 2 rows ahead. The woman's posture was confident, her gaze steady, but there was a familiarity in the way she adjusted her seat. As if preparing for the possibility of being questioned, Maya reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. When the plane landed, she would find a way to hand it to the young woman, offering not just her contact information but an invitation, a reminder that she didn't have to navigate the journey alone. As the plane cruised above the clouds, Maya let herself rest, her thoughts quiet. She didn't think of her speech, the conference, or the ripples she had set in motion. For now, she simply allowed herself to exist, carried forward by the steady hum of progress, both in the sky and on the ground below.